crap. Good evening, friends. I'd like to welcome you to What's in Tegan's Storage Locker. It's the show that dares to ask the question, just what is in my storage locker? The answer, as always, is comic books. I grab a fistful of undifferentiated comics, more or less. We go through them on the channel here for your edification and entertainment. So let's start today. This is the 25th episode. So I was thinking, well, what could I do for the 25th episode? I didn't get any takers on going up to the storage unit to get any games or toys. So let's just do an all Marvel episode here. That might be fun, just sort of wallow in it. Why don't we? The last episode I recorded was an endurance trial, thanks to you-know-who. But there is the chance that he may have tired himself out, because he's actually sitting on the chair behind me. Let's just, keep cool. See how long we can make it. All right, so Thor number 423. Cover dated from late September of 1990, meaning it would have been out at the height of the summer. I bought this since there's a UPC code on it. I didn't get it on one of my infrequent trips to a comic book store in another town. I bought this at the 7-Eleven in town because that's where I usually bought Thor, at the 7-Eleven on the way home from school. That, every Tuesday, I think every Tuesday, if all things were equal, I'd get my allowance and we'd stop at the 7-Eleven on the way home from school on every Tuesday. And it was a wonderful system. It was great while it worked. It slowly fell apart here over the next handful of years. But, the very early 90s was, sort of a late salad days in terms of what they were offering on the newsstand. It seemed like there was a lot of good books on the stand at that time in hindsight. And what we're looking at one of them right now, which I have to admit, I took for granted at the time, because I knew, in the way that, kids know these things, I knew that Thor wasn't a cool book. Thing is, Thor was still read, even if it wasn't anyone's favorite book. It always sold well. It sold, pretty much independently of the other Avengers titles. It was a very strong newsstand seller because, he had a very recognizable name. For some reason, it just stuck very early. They considered it one of their more, parent-friendly books in terms of, the actual market research of what characters were bought by who. Spider-Man, Conan, Thor. They were books your mom or your dad recognized and could pick up for you. So that was very valuable real estate. For some reason, Thor was always one of Marvel's top-selling books, right alongside Spider-Man, Hulk, and I think on, the newsstand, that the numbers attest, it sold well up through the end of the newsstand. And then it kind of struggled because it was a character that, had done well for a mass audience and wasn't necessarily tailor-made for the direct market. And so there were many years of adjustment where there were some kind of weird Thor stories around the turn of the century, and a little bit later sort of trying to figure out what Thor could be. And then, in the middle of that, in the decade, Straczynski shows up, and, I think in a lot of ways he just wrote a very normal Thor comic, just kind of stylistically updated for the modern era, and it sold really well, and that kind of set the tone. Like, more or less, the message of JMS's run on Thor for me was like, yeah, maybe you don't have to, worry so much. It's Thor. Just keep to the Thor basics, and you got a compelling comic book. So too here. This is, in some ways, you could almost describe it as, very meat and potatoes for what a Thor comic should be. It's about Thor going into space, interacting with the High Evolutionary and the Celestials to, and with Hercules as well in a supporting role. So a book full of Jack Kirby concepts, just sort of, hanging around and bouncing off each other, drawn extraordinarily well. You couldn't ask for a better dollar comic on the newsstand in 1990. Let me tell you, in summer of 1990 when Thor went bi-weekly and we were getting the Black Galaxy saga every 2 weeks. Friend, we were eating well in those days, I assure you. And I didn't even know at the time. Because like I say, I knew Thor wasn't cool. I was reading X-Men. I wasn't necessarily understanding X-Men, which, you know, I think understanding X-Men was something that I needed to grow up a bit to do because, you know, the very early 90s X-Men was kind of opaque in some ways. For all his, you know, various virtues, Thor is very easy to get. Very easy for your mom to get. And very easy for your mom to get you. Even though he never had a TV show from the, well, except for the weird Marvelmation one in the late 60s. But, you know, Fantastic Four, they had a couple cartoons. Iron Man, even he had a cartoon in the 90s. Thor never had a cartoon, even though you'd think he would be the most toyetic of them all. But he never had a cartoon series. Oh, man, you're starting off with a fantastic view here. You got the team supreme of Ron Frenz and Joe Sinnott, which, like I say, we didn't appreciate at the time. We didn't appreciate. There was a comic book. Joe Sinnott was still inking monthly comics up through the very early 90s. And he made everything he touched look fantastic. It's amazing, and no one really talks about it. I think because Joe Sinnott has... We almost take him for granted. Not almost. We do take him for granted. You know, whenever people talk about, like, favorite Kirby inker, it's almost like he's disqualified. No one ever really talks about him because I think people's assumption is, yeah, he's the home crowd fave, so to speak. His inks just look nice. They made Jack look really good. Really good. And I have long been of the perhaps impish philosophy that the best Jack Kirby is the uninked Jack Kirby, and that was an opinion I got in the mid-90s as still in my formative years when I discovered the Kirby Collector and I saw all those uninked pages and I realized, oh, wait a minute. He uses the size of the pencil. There's so much depth, there's so much dimension, and no inker ever came close to capturing the nuance of Jack Kirby's pencils, and I will swear that up and down. But nevertheless, the books were inked. They were sometimes inked better than times than others, and one of the very best times, most people will agree, even if you may say, like, okay, he's a bit heavy-handed. It looks like Joe Sinnott's inking. But isn't that remarkable that he's such a good, distinctive quality inker that you hear his voice alongside Jack Kirby? That is remarkable. That, I think, he's always been my favorite Kirby inker. I appreciate all the Kirby inkers in their way. But, you know, if we're talking about who made the nicest looking book, if we're discounting Wally Wood, because Wally Wood inked a vanishingly small number of Kirby stories. And if we're disqualifying him because he just didn't really do enough, that even if we can look at what he did and say, okay, these guys worked really well together, you can't really take that too far because they only worked together a few times, a handful of times, so to speak. Whereas Sinnott, he made a lot of comics with Sinnott, and you look back and my goodness. And you can say something we didn't appreciate at the time was that Ron Frenz is working in the mode of Kirby. I think at the time people just found it kind of grating because Kirby was still within living memory. It was still too close to what had been Marvel's house style for so long. And yet you look back on it and realize, oh, I was waiting to turn that page because I remembered. This one's a stunner. Look at this. And the comic was coming out twice a week at this time. Look at that. This is, I want to say, Thor's clone that the Celestials made. And he's just kind of a bestial thug type creature. And I guess he's in league with Stellaris there, who I really like, but never really got used much. And there's your guy. There's Thor, this really tiny figure, overwhelmed alongside the High Evolutionary. Look at that. Look at that. And you can say now, like, no, he was, Ron Frenz at the turn of the 90s was in a Kirby mode in the same way that I think we can say someone like Tom Scioli works in a Kirby mode, looking at Kirby as a mode, put Ladron alongside that. People who really just, breathe Kirby down to every pore, and it becomes the basis for their style, even though it's recognizably, another man's style, in a lot of ways. It's a bit more visible, I think, than, say, Mobius. There's a lot of artists who take over Mobius. But, a lot of that is like scale, mood. Whereas taking after Kirby, it's a bit more in your face. Like, look at these figures. Look at this. This is, at this point, Frenz, he'd been drawing for almost a decade. He'd had a long run on Amazing Spider-Man. In hindsight, I don't think his Amazing Spider-Man is anywhere near as strong. It's very formative in the same way that John Romita Jr.'s first run on Spider-Man is formative. It's not as interesting by far as their later work would be. And I honestly think that it was working with Sinnott that was very, very formative. Even if Frenz later sort of moved away from that approach, working with such a responsive inker, someone who makes you look good. Someone who makes you look this good, you're going to learn from it. That's the value of an inker that we don't get that in the modern day. We don't get that sense of two artists interacting on the page, which was what a really good penciler inker combo can give you. You got two different people putting their all into making this page look as good as it can. And what happens here? This is just like middle of the page. They're not even trying to sell it as that consequential. But it's dynamic. It gets you into the story, and then you cut away for this character piece, and boom, it just goes. This comic, we're already on page 6, and it just goes like this. They're not waiting around. We're in the middle of a 6-part story, and we're going to use every panel we have. I mean, look at that. There's a lot happens in this page, and it's fantastic. It looks fantastic. In some ways, it's kind of, you can look back on it, because comics today wouldn't start off with 6 pages of really tight, dense action like that. They just wouldn't. And you can look back and say, well, there's a lot of panel busy work. It's just creating problems for Thor to solve in 3 panels. And it's like, yeah, well, that's the book. That's the point of your book. You're throwing problems in front of Thor and figuring out, waiting to figure out if he's going to throw a hammer at it or punch it. It takes him a long time to figure out, is this a hammer situation or is this a fist situation? And he's seeing these guys and he's thinking, oh, it's going to be a hammer situation. Really, doing the work of bringing together some early Marvel Kirby characters with later run Marvel Kirby characters. This built on the Evolutionary War, because Hercules' status quo and the High Evolutionary status quo, the characters were very intertwined for a couple of years because of the Evolutionary War, and that's why they were connected in this way. And this was kind of interesting because for a while, it seems like in any other book, whenever a High Evolutionary shows up in any other book, he is just an absolute maniac. When he shows up in Thor, suddenly there's a lot more conversations. Sort of weird. He's a Thor supporting character who gets written kind of differently in the rest of the line. Because Thor just sort of treats him as a mad scientist. Not like a genocidal maniac, which he is when he shows up in pretty much anything these days. Oh, and there's Count Tegar. Man, this is just gorgeous. Look at this. Look at this. Page after page. Oh, no, here are the Celtic guys we were talking about. Oh, who was I talking about? Was that the episode of Marvel... The issue of Marvel Comics Presents we looked at the other day had those guys' solo story, the Celtic gods, and they're hanging around with Sif. That's why and he destroys a cab. That's why they're hanging around Sif, because Sif was always just doing the scut work, like, go fetch these guys. because this ties into what's going on in the back of the book. 1990 player photo cards. That was right at the zenith of more trading cards. Right at the zenith of the trading cards. Boom. But video games were starting to creep their way back in. There aren't a lot of video game ads in the late 80s Marvel, and then suddenly they're back, but it's different systems. And you get very always a lot of it seemed like this had a real Peyton Place vibe when they weren't like dealing with Thor stuff, because the human supporting cast, there was a lot of like soap opera stuff going on. And it was pretty good because it was adult soap opera. It wasn't like high school kids. It was like people argue, people going to bat for like this divorced architect guy who was kind of a flake because he was always having to go be Thor. But see, there's a lot. Man, goodness, look at this. Like I say, I paid $1 for this at 7-Eleven in 1990. That is, look at how gorgeous this is. This is just about more gorgeous than, this is more gorgeous than any comic I bought new in a while. And we just took this level of gorgeous for granted. And this was bi-weekly. My goodness, look at this. Shades of Al Williamson. That is so striking. I guess what happened here is they're just dealing with the Celestials had some business with Hercules. For some reason, they wanted them to bring Hercules back to the Black Galaxy, and Thor's like, "Oh, you guys, you just tricked us. It was a trap." It's like, well, what do you expect? The Celestials don't really have a lot of respect for humanity. Oh goodness. And there's the dude. I forget, that's the beat here. He gets separated from the dude for a few issues. Eric Masterson. Oh man, look at that. It's just, oh my goodness. Can you imagine being a kid in 1990 and like reading this and like, I forget, like what was I, 4th, 5th grade? My goodness. And I know there's a lot of people who maybe slept on Thor at the time because it wasn't cool, even though it still sold really well. It wasn't cool. But look at this. Undeniable. My goodness. Weaving together all these bits of Thor, because the Celestials, they were a big part of Thor for a couple points. High Evolutionary, he's the Thor guy. A great supporting cast that doesn't get a lot of play nowadays in Thor, because Thor is so focused, and this is, a consequence of JMS's run. Thor is so focused on the mythology stuff that sometimes you just wish that they'd remember, like, half of the fun is always just putting this weird, ancient Norse god in a sci-fi setting. That's half the fun from the Kirby stuff. And not everyone gets that. But you could do like a really big sci-fi arc in Thor now, and that would probably really kill, because no one's done that in forever. So the back half, no, not back half, maybe the back quarter of the book is these backup stories that are both written by Tom DeFalco, this and the front story, but this has got Gary Hartle on pencils with Mike DiCarlo inker, and there's a war. If I recall correctly, they're building just a war between two guys, between Ymir here, who's the big, head frost giant from Norse mythology, and him just getting into a big brawl with, he's not in this one, I think maybe he's in the next one, with Surtur. Surtur shows up in the last few episodes, and it's basically just about, Ymir and Thor, or Ymir and Surtur going at each other. And, Thor ends up at the very last issue, coming in after he's done, right when he's done with the Black Galaxy stuff. He goes and has to solve this problem in Asgard. And I think that was, I want to say, the little page with Sif and these schmucks. I want to say that's building towards something in that, but don't quote me on that, because like I say, I haven't read that one in forever. but I read it so many times when I was a kid because I like that story. I liked Thor always, I think, better, more than I credited. Let's see, what's next? Well, how about we just go for it? Another fruit of the summer of 1990. I did an annual last time, so let's just do another annual. I love annuals. I always bought the annual, so I have all of them. Even for books I didn't buy, I bought the annual sometimes. If there was a crossover or something. I just loved annuals. You get a bigger comic, usually you got to pay twice as much. Twice as much for a bigger comic. Sometimes it's great, sometimes it's not. But when it's great, it's really great. That's, look back at the 80s. You remember a lot of the annuals. Not just the X-Men annuals. There were some good Spider-Man stories in the annuals. Even, decent Fantastic Four annuals through Byrne's run. And yet, for some reason, annuals just always have a really bad name with some people. And I don't get it. Because, maybe you didn't like the crossover story. Admittedly, like when they did the Scattershot. Is that the name of it? Shattershot? I can't remember. The bad X-Men one from 92. I didn't care for that one, and I think that one sort of got away from them. But this, Days of Future Present, first of all, Rob Liefeld cover from, right when he was taking over the New Mutants. So he didn't draw the main story, but, he still had a hand in this, and certainly this cover probably sold the book to a lot of people. Nice symmetrical design here. He never scrimps on simple forms. That's the C. Once you see, it's all based on very simple design principles with him. He's not afraid to use symmetry. A lot of people avoid. They're taught to avoid symmetry. But that's not, but symmetry is something Liefeld uses a fair amount. And you get this nice little long text page about hi, my name is David, and today I'm your guide through the wonderful world of the New Mutants annual contents page. You may not know me, but I'm Bob Harris's editor of the lot for this fine publication, who also likes to say conundrum a lot. Personal assistant here at Marvel. Okay, I'm a college intern, and since Bob is currently residing at the Belleville Home for the Insane, recovering from a multiple nervous breakdown, oh boy, the responsibility for writing this page has fallen to me. Well, boy, have I got a story for you. So I guess that's just about the construction of the annual. Drawn by Terry Shoemaker and Chris Wozniak, written by Walt Simonson, who wrote half of the story. I think Claremont wrote the other half, I want to say. I don't remember who wrote the X Factor one. And you got a backup story and pinups. So there is some Liefeld in the back. See, you get a lot for your $2. Because Terry, oh man, that's nice. Oh, Louise Simonson wrote that one. Yeah, because she was doing New Mutants at the time. Well, Walter Simonson did the Fantastic Four annual. And then Chris Claremont did the X-Men annual. I'm not remembering who did the X Factor one. But it was the people who were writing the books, more or less. Oh man, look at that. So this is Franklin Richards. This is grown-up Franklin Richards. Really the first story to focus on the grown-up Franklin Richards as a character. And it also focuses on Rachel Summers, because they're two characters, both from, the Days of Future Past, future. And partly this story was to introduce this Ahab guy who, I loved him at the time. I thought he was going to be a big villain, and he fizzled out completely. Never really did anything after this. Showed up in a couple crowd scenes. He had an arc in Uncanny Avengers, believe it or not. That's how long they sat on him. Maybe the biggest thing they've done with him since this story. years later in X Factor, they introduced a supporting character who was going to turn into him in the future. And it was so, it just seemed like that's years ago, man. Like the time to hit on the Ahab train was not like 5-6 years later. So here's the team at the time, right, as they looked in the early days of the Liefeld era, because that's the costume Liefeld gave her, I think. I forget what they're doing. There's our boy. There's Cable. Oh, they're hanging around the danger room, because this was a period where they were just basically they moved the team back to where they used to live. But I think Cable probably would like to think of it that he was squatting there, even though they had every right to live there. At the time, none of the other X-Men knew this guy except for Wolverine. But he didn't have any history with the team. So they came back and he's like, well, who's this weird guy? Well, funny thing about that, Scott. Although it would be a couple years before they went around to actually finalizing that. So Franklin Richards shows up with this crowd. I don't really know what's. I'm not going to read the story actually. Hit the dirt. So there's some fighting involved. Dealing with these characters who I don't think ever showed up again. Some of them. Let's see here. Franklin Richards is just using his powers to alter reality in a very upsetting way, because he's kind of losing it. Coming back to the past like this is just kind of messing with his head. And that's basically what happens for the whole thing, is because he comes back because he's going through some things. He's having trouble, and his troubles start to cause trouble because he's the most powerful mutant in the world, at least at this time. And I'm sure they're going to restore that. That was too big of a plot. That was too big a part of the mythos for a very long time. They're not going to let him not be a mutant for forever. But at the time, at least, he was the most powerful mutant, and that was his whole gimmick. Why, even as a kid, he was really powerful. He could, even just what he could do as Tattletale, that was his power pack, code name. Even just that, he could see the future. So Reed shows up because, they're right, his family's right at the center of this, which is, why it's an interesting crossover, because it's as much a Fantastic Four story, because it's basically just about how that character sort of makes them, a tertiary part of the X-Men mythos, and they, because their son is involved, they have to deal directly with this. And so Ahab's hounds come from the future. And, oh man, that's a great shot. That's a great shot, even if Banshee's in it. It's a nice looking Sue. If I recall correctly, so that's Sue and Reed. If I recall correctly, they split up so that the other half of the X-Men and the other half of the Fantastic Four are in the X Factor annual. And then they meet up with the X-Men in the X-Men annual. The X-Men basically just wander in at the last minute. But that's how the team is reunited, a lot of them after being separated for a long time. Because Storm and Gambit. Storm brings Gambit. His first appearance was actually in the X-Men annual, and then he appeared in the book later. Before he'd had his introduction to the team in the regular book. Man, look at this. This, I think, Chris Wozniak, that's him, and that is him. This, strange perspective. Very much, taking after Liefeld in some respects with his layouts. A lot of people were taking after Liefeld, who had very distinctive layout skills. And people who, wanted to take something from him could do that. Silvestri did that. Oh, man, look at this, though. two different artists. You can see where, you know, they switched over. And Chris Wozniak, if you're not familiar, he had an interesting run of mostly fill-in stuff. He did some Excalibur, all in this kind of, and he did a couple of Avengers West Coast, if I recall correctly, as well. He had sort of a, for lack of a better word, more cartoony style, but really dynamic, really dynamic. Oh, Rachel Summers. This is a... but she didn't have long hair. She didn't have that hair at the time. Oh, so this is... he's having a weird flashback. Okay, that's what it is. He's got all sorts of weird time problems. Because they wouldn't have screwed something like that up. I mean, the people writing this comic. So, Fantastic Four squaring down with the alongside Cable. Getting a Sentinel. That's a fun panel. Ooh, look at that. Look at that. Like I say, $2. I did buy this one during one of my trips to the comic book store. That's how into annuals I was. I bought them. If I saw a new annual at the comic book store, I took it home. Because, there was always a chance you wouldn't, catch an annual on the newsstand. Yeah, he's freaking out, and the big Franklin and little Franklin come together. So little Franklin, he's still wearing the 4.5 age sweatshirt. So little Franklin's having problems, and then he realizes, that bad things are going to happen. And and this drove people nuts, because Richter says something about, like, anyone notice how much Cable looks like Ahab? And that, Louise Simonson, she's writing that. Maybe that was where she was going to go with that. And then she just, didn't last on the books. Because that was, people remembered it, but it was never, obviously never followed up. Oh, and I remember this, a Dead Doug story. A Dead Doug solo story. Who wrote this? This was, are there credits in here? No, this is a David, so I guess that'd be Peter David with Curtis. I'm not remembering who Curtis, Gavin, Ian, something like that. I don't know. Dan Panosian, early Panosian job. But yeah, this sort of, you look at this and this reads like a Peter David story, two ghosts sitting around playing cards. That is totally a Peter David conceit here. He was writing, a few X books. He wrote a fair amount of Wolverine stories over the couple of years here. And he ended up writing X Factor too. And he came to regret writing X Factor, even though later, in the 2000s, he would come back and have a much longer run with those characters. Even though he still had to do crossovers. That was why he soured on X Factor the first time. This is really maudlin stuff, if I recall correctly. Oh, so someone's visiting. Oh, okay, so he's seeing Rain, who is real, coming and visit his grave, because I'm sure she does that all the time. But he can't actually communicate with her. Except when she turns into a wolf, suddenly she does hear him. Wait a minute. Have they ever she can see ghosts. Like, she is just looking at a ghost here. She wouldn't be the only character. The Hulk, a weird trait that finally got explained during Immortal Hulk, but, it was always a part of his power set. For some strange reason, the Hulk can see ghosts. Maybe Wolfsbane can see ghosts too. Has it ever been covered anywhere else? And then you turn the page and you get a glimpse into the future. Shatterstar. I think that's probably that's his first appearance. Ilyana, she was supposed to, I guess, have been a part of it, but she had been de-aged at the time, and maybe they didn't want to. Magma, they never ended up come. They did not end up coming back to Magma during the rest of the run of New Mutants. She was in limbo for a long time. So yeah, Shatterstar was never on. He joined the team. I mean, he didn't even really join the New Mutants. He basically just showed up in like New Mutants 98 or 1999. And then basically the moment he showed up, it's like, oh, let's change the name on the change the name on the sign. So yeah, this is what was going on. They had a bunch of books. They must have been doing pretty well for sales, because they had been doubling up on some of their more popular books for shipping for years. X-Men double shipped in the summer for a couple of years. And they were double shipping again. And I guess they had success with that, because by this time, all the best selling books, Avengers, Thor, Amazing Spider-Man, Captain America, Punisher, X-Men, these were all their best-selling newsstand books. And then you got Excalibur and X-Men too, although they didn't have storylines. They were just the regular book went bi-weekly for this period. But these other... you can see some of them have story names, and some of them are just, the book's going to double ship. But this was the season that Captain America did methamphetamines, and the Return of the Sinister Six, which is just absolute primo Eric Larson on early Eric Larson on Spider-Man. And the Jigsaw puzzle, which isn't maybe remembered as fondly. I want to say that's the one where he fights Belasco. Not the best remembered Punisher saga. And the Crossing Line. We looked at a couple issues of that, because, I was buying a lot of Marvel in 1990, sorry to say. Oh, and there's our boy. There's our boy. Oh, man. In some respects, I guess you had to be there. But if you were there, oh man, this was an exciting time. And see, Marvel Annuals, that's just last episode we read the Daredevil Annual. Because we're all about 1990. I need to get another box. I know, I need to get another box from the storage unit. How are we doing on time here? Let's see what else we have. Let's see. Okay, let's do a fun one. Fantastic Four 281 from the prime time of John Byrne on the Fantastic Four. And you can definitely say that there's a line where the art changes in the Byrne Fantastic Four. But I'm gonna speak up for the later Byrne run of Fantastic Four, because they were smart enough to realize that Byrne needed an inker at this point. And they brought in Jerry Ordway, who most people probably know as a DC guy, although he's done a fair amount of Marvel, here and there over the years. And he had a significant run on inking Byrne, on Byrne's last, I want to say, year and change on Fantastic Four. And man, let me tell you, and you're looking at the Malice costume and thinking like, oh boy, we're in for a joyride. This was the last, not the last, it wasn't the last arc, but it was, we're nearing the end of Byrne's run on Fantastic Four, although I think he still has a good year left at this point. But you can see, you get Jerry Ordway involved, well, suddenly you're talking a different ballgame altogether. I cannot say enough good things about Jerry Ordway. I just reread Crisis on Infinite Earths. And let me tell you, when he comes on that book, it really cooks. People don't talk about Crisis on Infinite Earths as an art book because everything else about it is so complicated. but it looks gorgeous. And it looks gorgeous because you got one of the best pencilers in the business working with Jerry Ordway. And, you know, Jerry Ordway can ink Perez. He can ink Byrne. He sort of makes them all look a little bit like Jerry Ordway, and that's a sign of a good inker. You know, you see two artists on the page. And man, look at that. There's your, you know, three villains. Sue Storm, who has been mind altered by the Psycho Man, and this iteration of the Hate Monger, which was just a dude. Oh man. Oh man. Look at that. Look at that. That is a gorgeous spread. You know, if you look back at Byrne in the 80s, you know, buildings, the black and white, this motif of the black and white windows on buildings actually showed up quite a bit in his work. And he got a lot of juice out of these high contrast compositions, although this isn't purely black and white. But man, look at how nicely that's colored. Who's coloring that? Is that Glynis Oliver? I was going to say Glynis Oliver. I should have just said Glynis Oliver, then I would have really impressed you. Oh, man. And, of course, you know, Hate Mongers just whipping up a frenzy. The ancient envies, the almost tribal prejudices all across the city. Each tiny tableau repeats and repeats, weaving into a massive tapestry of hatred. Oh, man. I mean, it's just awful what we're seeing here, but it's drawn so well. I mean, look at this high man. You can't say this isn't a nice-looking comic book. Say what you will about John Byrne. He knew how to put together a good comic book. You know, get a good inker with him if he's starting flag in that area, and suddenly, boom. Then you're cooking with gas, friend. There's that DP Orbitron again. Oh, man. I mean, he makes that absolutely absurd costume look good. You have to admit. Oh, here's our boy Daredevil, suddenly just hopping along. Byrne draws a nice Daredevil. He never had a run on Daredevil. He drew a fair amount of Daredevil covers over the years, and he just had a good feel for this kind of lean gymnast character. Definitely, you know, a type he could draw. Oh, classic Byrne composition there. Seeing his approach and then using, you know, multiple parts of the picture plane. Really, he's putting some effort into this. Even, you know, maybe having an inker sort of frees him up to be a little bit more, you know, interesting with his layouts, because this is a nice looking comic book. I saw that, you know, I'm sort of talking around that comics tropes did a John Byrne episode, maybe a month or so ago as of this recording. A very good episode. I agree with a lot of what's in it. But, you know, in reality, I think that there are some patches where even after, you know, his work on Fantastic Four changed, once he brings an inker in, I think the book picks up a lot. This last year or so looks dynamite. And, you know, likewise on Namor. You know, Namor, I think, is one of the most gorgeous things John Byrne has ever done the first year in Namor. And I never see anyone mention that book. It's not a very well-known run at all, but it's gorgeous. I'm telling you right now, it's gorgeous. He uses screen tone, copious amounts, and it looks sublime. And you can tell it's really labor-intensive because he can only do it for a year. And after a year, he stops drawing the book that way. But man, oh, look at this. This is how the Fantastic Four should look. Oh man, I know I sound so old. I sound so old. Hey, here's a tie-in with the Wraith War. ROM 65, what was I saying? After ROM 51, all the Marvel books, you know, get drafted to be part of the dire Wraith War. Oh man, he knew how to go minimal. That's one thing you can say about Byrne. And you can also say, well, you know, he understood the value. He understood that a good sense of minimalism could be a time-saving measure. And that is a very true thing. And he used it to great effect. And then sometimes you get a whole issue of Snowbird fighting a Yeti in a snowstorm. I have the book at my foot right here because I have this whole Alpha. Oh man, I promise you, I'm not going to read the John Byrne Alpha Flight on the TikTok. That's like 3 years. I still like those comics, and I don't even really like Alpha Flight. Somehow I've read every Alpha Flight in existence, but I don't even really like those characters. This is the period where She-Hulk was in the team, and she really fit in well. You know, people like her with the Fantastic Four. There's a reason she always comes back for this, that, or the other thing, because she just sort of fits in as a member of the family, because she needed a family. That was sort of her thing. Her gimmick is being a family member for someone who she sees maybe like twice a year if she's, you know, if she's been bad. And she loves her cousin. We know she does. But it's never a good thing when, you know, it's not like really the bosom of family with Bruce there. But, you know, she can be part of the Richardses, and she's the connection between, you know, between the same way that the Fantastic Four have a connection to the X-Men. You know, they have a very strong connection with, you know, the Hulk family, you know. They're going to come to, you know, Jen's aid if she needs it. Oh, man, look at that. Look at that. What? Mr. Fantastic versus the Invisible Woman? That is a nice sequence right there. Look at the texture on Reed. Ooh, man. It's all over. Now you are going to die. And believe me, your pathway to death's dark domain will not be easy. I intend to see you suffer, Reed Richards. Suffer as you has never suffered before. Wow. My goodness. Here's just hoping this sequence doesn't awaken anything in you. Star Wars puffy stickers. Oh my God. You know how much, I wasn't even that into superheroes at that age. But puffy stickers with superheroes, what kid wouldn't like those? Superheroes on American cheese product? Man, you're talking about the 80s. I'm not one of those like, oh, the 80s are that, you know, perfect. But, you know, the 80s, when it came to crass merchandising aimed at children, absolutely flawless game. But then why would you even consider that your utter defeat could come at the hands of one for whom you have no respect? Susan Storm, the Invisible Girl. Oh, you know, and that was the theme. And you know, say what you will about the man. The theme of his run was developing her character. And you can say that maybe he's not the man you would have picked in hindsight to do it, and yet he is the man who did it. So, you know, Daredevil's part of the fun too, and he's like, what are we going to do? We can't fight your wife. You're right, because Sue Storm would kill you. Like, Daredevil, if Sue Storm was trying to kill you, your best chance is to be on the bus out of town. I'm sorry. But, you know, that was actually a plot point in a recent issue of the current Fantastic Four run, was people suddenly figured out, wait a minute, she could, like, destroy the planet if she wanted to. Like, you know, maybe we've never actually come to grips with just how powerful she is. People have been saying that since the early 80s. We'll come back to the bullpens, because that's actually got some interesting stuff. Oh, there you go. See, out of context, that's bad. Even in context, you kind of think, well, was there a better way you could have dealt with that? This is going to, yeah, that's going to live with Richards forever. Maybe not. It's not as bad in context, certainly, as the Hank Pym slap. But at the same time, it's like, well, you know, it brought her out of it, which you can't say. You know, like I say, in context, you know, it makes sense. But out of context, you don't want anyone to draw you doing that on panel. You just don't. Wow, here's a letter from Stan Lee. Just read Fantastic Four 276. Don't know how you do it. The mag just gets better and better. Congratulations to John B., Jim Shooter, and you. You're doing our little foursome proud. There you go. Oh, this is interesting. Before we begin, Roz and Jack Kirby via Secret Wars 2 anchor Steve Leialoha have passed along some more information we thought we should let you in on. Apparently, it was Artie Simic, longtime Marvel bullpenner and renowned letterer until his untimely death in '75, who inked the very first issue of Fantastic Four, not the late Salt Brodsky, as we erroneously reported in issue 272. Saul actually began inking this book with its second issue. If not for the groundwork laid by the pioneers of this industry, none of us would or could be doing what we do today. And so this issue is respectfully dedicated with admiration and recognition for those who have gone before us. Dear creationists? That's a weird way to start a letter. Question of the month. What's your favorite color? John Byrne, black. Jerry Ordway, red. John Workman, blue. Glynis Oliver, blue. Mike Carlin, purple. Jim Shooter, does anyone really know what time it is? Oh, and this is a weird joke. Then they ask the same question a minute later, and they give different answers. Did they not get letters that month? Sometimes they would have a question of the month, and they'd actually have interesting answers, but that one wasn't doing it. Secret Wars 2. Oh man, there's a Byrne cover on that issue of Daredevil. One of the weirdest issues of Daredevil. Even though it's drawn by David Mazzucchelli, it's a terrible story. This is a very good issue of the Hulk, even though it resulted in... I think that this is the period, that's the issue of the Incredible Hulk that got Barry Windsor Smith Dutch with Marvel over them basically... it's the story of the Monsters graphic novel, essentially. This is the Secret Wars 2 crossover, very influential bit of comics history. And this Payday instant winner game. All right, so what are we doing on time here? Oh, we got a few minutes left. What do we got? That took us, a while. All right, let's close out the show with something fun. An issue from The Crossing. Oh, yeah. This is from, they were doing pretty well in 1990. They were not doing pretty well in 1995. Things had taken a turn. The stunning return to the most unexpected Avenger ever. And you can tell they're using these early computer fonts that just look so dinky in hindsight. Oh, my God. And this is from the tail end of the Bob Harris run. Bob Harris is co-writing with Terry Kavanagh. And, I do not think it holds up for a couple very important reasons. But I can't say I didn't enjoy the Bob Harris Avengers. I was on hooks for a big part of it, and then I think it kind of fell apart in the end. And in hindsight, I really don't like how it treated Cersei. I think it treated Cersei very unfairly, and that was enough. That's enough in hindsight. I think a big reason to sour me on the run. I just don't think it used some of its characters well, even if, month to month, I was into the storyline. And everything by now has just evolved, because this is the story where, and a while ago on the show, we looked at a Teen Tony issue. And this is the story that gave us Teen Tony. This is the story that was built around this heel turn for Iron Man, where we find out that Iron Man has been working for Kang the whole time. And they eventually needed Heroes Reborn to happen so that they could figure out a way to wipe that off the slate. MC Wyman on pencils. He did a fair amount of work for Marvel at the time, with Tom Palmer on inking, with early computer coloring by the Malibu Computer Coloring Department. And, they're doing something. This is, I guess, at the very beginning of the story, because they're not fighting Iron Man yet, but this is right before everything falls apart. Because if I recall correctly, the instigating event for the Crossing is a murder in Avengers mansion. I can't remember who's murdered. Oh, I think it was the Avengers nanny, or no, Yellow Jacket. A few people died in the Crossing. A couple of whom didn't come back, like the woman who was working as the nanny for the Avengers when they had Crystal's daughter living in the mansion. Introduction to Advanced Dungeons and Dragons. Man, the resurgence of Dungeons and Dragons. I guess I saw that coming. But man, it really, really has permeated everything, hasn't it? People love their Dungeons and Dragons. And man, that's a beefy looking Hank Pym. And the sword, I forget which swordsman, because there were a couple swordsmen. There was a swordsman who was in the earlier part of the Harris run, who was a member of the Gatherers. That was the big bad, the Gatherers. Oh, we'll come back to the bullpens page. Oh, wow. Whoa. Oh, and thereafter, oh boy, they're going in deep, because that's the plant swordsman. The plant swordsman who married Mantis, and then they had, the kid who later became a big part of, what's that one? Empire. Empire is the name of it, the crossover they did a few years ago. It was using a bunch of the Englehart, toys. Trying, I think, to make something, more of them by crossing them over with the Young Avengers characters. Tobias, the plant thing, has friends. As always, they find fools to fight their battles. Man, like, multiple swordsmen. If you got one, I'm sorry. There has never been an interesting Marvel character named the Swordsman. Always, you're in for a bad time when one of those guys shows up, because they're just very negative energy people. It's a costume and a name with a bad vibe associated with it. Spider-Man fruit roll-ups. Oh, someone woke up. We're almost done here. Can you hold off for a minute before you freak out? Oh yeah, so Marilla, she was the kid is sad because her nurse just died, was murdered, and there's a beefy Pietro. You think the guy who runs all the time could be a bit leaner. What is that? It's just this weird purple artifact in his hand. Oh, we're going fancy. That's not an ugly spread. It's interesting. Someone, putting a bit of thought into this rather thoughtless story. Oh man, this coloring. There's something to be said for, I guess, the garishness of this very early experiments, but it is very clearly an experiment. And this type of orange, this type of orange is very much an ultraverse color. Regrettable in any other context. Ow. Vision always gets it in these stories. Vision always gets it. At least he's not being ripped apart by She-Hulk. But that's a good sign that you're going to shatter the Avengers. You do something to that guy. Ugh. I do not know who these guys wielding the pole axes are. That's not a half bad looking page, though. It's a weird page, but it has some, energy to it. That is a color pink that you don't see in Marvel Comics every day. Oh, man. So it's not without some interest in terms of being really weird. Oh, there she is. Probably being written closer to how she should be written than don't get me started. I'm not even that big of a Mantis fan, but they just completely changed her character. I guess because, some of the parts of her character are maybe a bit less palatable for, mainstream audiences than others. Where was that bullpen? I know I saw it. There we go. Oh, and this is the year when this is the year that it broke Marvel. There's a Marvel before 1995 and a Marvel and after 1995. It hurt the company. They went bankrupt. And they went to war with each other, and they produced some. the fact is, there were some interesting comics in this year. I won't tell you that they didn't actually publish a few interesting books, because they were having trouble. So some stuff sneaked out. This is when they actually made Peter David's last Avengers story, which was actually kind of infamous at the time for him having written it more or less on spec, I believe, as a column, and then it became sort of popular. People who read it before they made a... and I actually, they did a Marvel Tales edition, and I got the second issue. I never had the second issue of it before, but they did a full edition of that. And the Crossing, they're right in the middle of the Crossing. And Lunatic, which was this really weird, this Defender's tertiary character who had this strange, brief resurgence in the mid-90s. He had a serial in Marvel Comics Presents, was what it was. I want to say Keith Giffen had something to do with it, because he did a couple of things in Marvel in the mid-90s. Only a couple. Keith Giffen, he's not someone who ever really does a lot of Marvel, but he always pokes up here and there. You look back and you see a fair amount of Marvel stuff over the years. You know, he's the one who basically gave their cosmic stuff a new lease on life with Annihilation. You can see how I get those mixed up in my head. There's no way Iron Man could be a murderer, is there? And of course, he ended up being the murderer, and people didn't take to that revelation. This was the month they brought back Reed Richards after he'd been dead for like 3 years, I think. And I was on hook. I loved Fantastic Four at this period. It was not a cool book, but I liked the DeFalco and Ryan Fantastic Four. We should look more of that on the... I'll dig some of those out for the next show. Oh, and they're launching the Star Masters book, which one of the most heartbreaking things is Mark Grunwald wrote an essay about the Star Masters book. It might even be at the end of the first issue of Star Masters, and it's the saddest essay, because it's basically talking about how the book, it went from being a book with a lot of ambitious ideas behind it to being a 3-issue limited series that basically just came and went. And Mark Grunwald wrote an essay about that process, basically about how everything at the company was sort of starting to fall apart. And in hindsight, it's dark stuff, because, you know, he didn't survive 1996. I want to say he died at the beginning of 96. And, you know, his death, you know, one of the things that changed the company. Wasn't the same after that. Never quite lost some spirit that never quite came back fully after the bankruptcy, I feel like. I don't remember what these were. Adventures of Goldhawk. That's a nice little illustration, though. I don't think I've ever heard of these before, but those are kind of fun illustrations there. All right. Well, we had fun. We had a fun little all Marvel episode. Stick around. I got plenty of stuff on here. If you like this. This is the 25th episode, so I got 24 previous episodes. Man, let me tell you something. I just sort of started doing these off a whim. And I didn't even tell anyone about them for like the first dozen episodes. And then I slowly sort of started putting it out there. But I wanted to put a stockpile up before people started stumbling along the channel. And, you know, it's kind of frustrating. You know, some episodes seem to do better than others, and there's no rhyme or reason. The algorithm just, you know, the algorithm does what the algorithm does. I'm going to keep doing them because I see growth potential. Ideally, what I'd really like is if I could get you to go to the Patreon and check things out there. I'm going to have a free newsletter starting up after the first of the year at some point. I'm sure I'll tell you all about it when time comes around. I have a podcast with Claire Napier. It's called Udder Madness. We talk about Top Cow Comics in all its glory. Witchblade, Mark Silvestri, Michael Turner, Cyberforce, all that good stuff. We're on Spotify, and we're also on YouTube. I put old videos up with video annotations. It takes forever for me to get around to doing it, but I think they turn out pretty well. People seem to like them, and you can find those probably a click away. And what else? Well, check out my Patreon. If you like what I'm doing here and you want to support me doing it, that's where I'd point you to. I got tons of stuff behind the paywall on my Patreon. My stuff can usually be found every week at the Comics Journal website, new reviews, essays, what have you. Have a good day. Take care of yourself. Treat yourself well. Treat your fellow humans well. Treat animals well. And do something nice for someone else today. Catch you later.